Round and round we go between Control and Aggro. Wrangle a winning deck with this State of the Meta lasso. Yeehaw!
It only counts if it mounts. Comment below as we walk through the Week 4 recap of Outlaw Standard. Alright, the Tier 1 list highlights not only the dominance of Azorius Control this past weekend, but the bet shifting in my favor. With Azorius Control taking home 4 trophies, count them, this past weekend, and Domain claiming only 1, I'm now ahead 8-6 in this bet, and things are heating up, Max. I love it. Joining the relentless grind of Control is Esper Midrange and Temur Analyst, but wait, we finally see the return of Dimir Control. For those of you who have watched this series routinely, you may remember us projecting that it would take about a month for Dimir Control to find its footing, but at long last, we are seeing that born to fruition right now, 1 month later, as predicted.
Oh yeah, and Tier 2 features the return of Golgari Midrange. Boros Convoke's fall landed it here as well. Domain continues to be a mainstay. Bant Toxic also maintains its stay here another week, likely in no small part due to the rise of Control in the format.
And last but not least, Brewer's Corner will feature 2 monocolored aggro decks, a thrifty Azorius Flash Tax build, and an out-of-pocket Gruul Terror combo.
Can't wait, can't wait. Rebels, we've partnered with TOAMagic on our State of the Meta series. For those of you who aren't already using TOA for your paper tournament needs, click the link below in our description to see their collection of singles and sealed product. Now, while you're there, don't forget to use code REBELLION for 5% off your purchase at checkout.
And as always, TOAMagic can deliver all your cards in one package with free track shipping on every order and over 1 million fulfilled orders to date. We're all about dependability here at the Rebellion, and we can confirm that TOA gets it done right.
All right, and now on to our Tier 1 archetype breakdown, starting with Azorius Control.
Jabberwocky took down the mirror in an MTGO challenge this past Saturday, cementing one hell of a weekend for the archetype as it took 19 pilots to top 8s across 12 events and won 4 trophies, making it the breakout deck of the week. A special shout out to MTG Rebellion Discord member Cody Witt-AK for making top 8 of 3 separate MTGO challenges with this archetype over the weekend. May not have gotten a trophy, bud, but that's one hell of a run, so props. Now, let's walk through this build a little bit. Here we can see that we have 4 March of Otherworldly Light, but 0 Destroy Evil and 0 Get Lost. I'm going to be honest, this is not the way I've built it, but I mean, Jabberwocky took a trophy with this for a reason. The March of Otherworldly Light is better positioned if you're not expecting a ton of Esper Midrange, whereas Destroy Evil starts to look a little bit better if you're expecting those Esper Midrange players to line up. And Get Lost, it's back and forth. You know, pros have really debated whether or not you want to give other players the ability to explore and draw those lands off the top. It kind of depends. Outside of that, we're not seeing any Farewell main, no Phantasmal Interference main, and 3 Jace between the main and the sides. So it's kind of a control knockout build to win that mirror, and I'm very intrigued by it.
Very interesting. What do you think is the biggest shift that this deck makes, if any at all, after this week, assuming that we go from this Domain Temur Control dominance to a more mid-range sort of dominance?
I mean, the shifts are mostly there because we see those depopulate sitting in the main, and that's in part there for the more aggressive, more mid-range kind of archetypes. But I would start shifting those marches over to Destroy Evils if I'm anticipating a lot of Esper mid-range, and otherwise there isn't a lot that needs to move. Like, we're down to the last 2 to 4 flex slots for this deck. It's so powerful in doing what it's trying to do for game plan A.
Yeah, we're going to be saying that a lot today, I have a feeling. We're getting down to very few flex slots in a lot of these lists. Speaking of which, let's go over to Esper Midrange.
Nishimoto Suzuki took down the 60-player Champions Cup special qualifier in Japan this past weekend with Esper Midrange as one of 11 pilots to top 8 various events and one of 2 trophies that went to the relentless Rafine lovers. So here's what shifted in this. We're not seeing Outlaws in the main anymore. That's gotten pushed over to the sideboard, which shouldn't surprise you because against Control, especially Azorius Control, where they have so much exile-based removal, Outlaws just isn't going to stick the landing. Now, we're still seeing the 3 cut downs and no long goodbyes, which again is suggesting we're moving more towards a very aggressive meta as well and trying to hedge for that. There's also 0 Shieldred in the list, which again, we see the control side, we see Wandering Emperor and how important that is in the Azorius Control mirrors. It's not really I don't know, surprising that it's going to be a critical component of Esper Midrange as we're doing this. And then we're seeing that 4th Fairy Mastermind over the 3rd Deep Cavern Bat, which, again, if we're playing against Azorius Control, we're playing against any deck that's drawing a lot of extra cards. Fairy Mastermind's going to keep you in that.
Makes a lot of sense. I want to ask a similar question here. Considering if we're assuming those kinds of shifts, does this deck shift at all to tackle a more mid-range or a more aggro meta? What would be a big shift for this deck to make? Perhaps the Wandering Emperors. What do you think?
I mean, if we're going to see a more mid-range meta, that is where Outlaws starts getting shoved back into the main. That's where Long Goodbye starts getting shoved back into the main, because we're going to need the ability to kill Rafine, even post-wedding announcement in the mirrors. We're going to need the ability to kill Preacher of the Schisms, Glissas, Gixes, and Long Goodbye does that. So if you start seeing Long Goodbyes and you start seeing more Deep Cavern Bats, Outlaws, that means we have more of a mid-range build. Whereas if the current build seems to be hedging for control and aggro and just eschewing that mid-range mirror.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the next deck in our Tier 1 archetypes, Temur Analyst.
Temur Analyst, or Temur. Iwamoto Shintaro smashed a 59-player Champions Cup special qualifier in Japan this past weekend with Temur Analyst, making them one of 10 pilots to top 8 and one of 2 trophies that it took home. So looking at this, we have kind of an interesting divide. This list did well. Literally a few days afterwards, we saw Ballesta take down a trophy as well. And the difference in their builds is actually kind of staggering, because there is no Kellen in the main of this list, whereas Ballesta had 3. There's also 1 Doppelgang in the main of this over that 4th Virtue of Strength, which I'm back and forth on. Like Doppelgang. I'm not sure why we want Doppelgang in our primary game plan, other than we needed an extra sideboard slot and we couldn't find room for anything else, right? And perhaps that's where they found that Seismic Wave slot that we're seeing right here. But again, do we really need this more than we need another Vampire's Vengeance or just any other card in the sideboard? It's a little hard to justify, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, a little spicy. And let's talk about that, actually. The 4th Virtue of Strength coming out, I assumed it was for that Doppelgang. What do you think about that shift? Would you just shift it back and put Doppelgang in the sideboard, or do away with it altogether?
I don't know that we need to worry about it as much. I would put the Virtue back 100%. I don't know that we need Doppelgang right now. I'm not seeing a ton of Stone Brains anymore. I'm not seeing people that are trying to disrupt with Cranial Extractions unless it's Dimir Control. So I'm really unclear that we need to be going on Doppelgang for that exact reason.
All right. Y'all heard it here. Let's talk about a surprising list next in our Tier 1 archetypes, Dimir Control.
So Gershi grabbed the trophy in a 17-player MTGO preliminary this past week, highlighting a strong overall run by the archetype as it rose from obscurity once more, featuring 7 total pilots in various top 8s. Now, for those who are looking at this going, how are we winning games? There's not a lot of ways. The primary win con is going to be Jace, the Perfected Mind, seen right here, going -5 or higher and just milling them out. Like, this is a deck that wants to win with a mill strategy. You have a backup strategy with Restless Reef and that single copy of Mirrex, but given the proliferation of Field of Ruins, especially in the control mirrors, it's going to come down to a mill strategy more often than not, and that is what this deck is trying to do. And in doing so, this deck is really saying we have inevitability over the entire format, and we are going to be the slowest deck in the format. It gets away with that to a degree because Deadly Cover-Up gives you 4 Cranial Extractions on top of Wraths. And for people that are like, oh, Domain's just going to be able to get more card advantage, that's fine, because their first Deadly Cover-Up is probably removing all their Atraxes, and the second one's ripping out all the Herd Domains. And if you can't beat 4 Archangels of Wrath, what are you doing with Control?
Yeah. Domain without those cards just kind of sitting there limp, dead in the water. That's wild to think about. But I mean, nonetheless, this deck is really hard for me to wrap my head around personally. I mean, not only because it's control, but just so few win cons. Are we shifting strategies in most of the matchups post board to have more win cons put into the deck?
Yeah, so if you looked at that sideboard, you'd see that there are a couple of different creatures. There's going to be a mixture of Seed Shark, there's going to be a mixture of Sheldred, and there's going to be Aclazotz. And part of this is that you're playing this kind of poker game back and forth where game 1, they have all of this removal, and basically all of it's dead against you. And then game 2, you're like, I have somewhere between 2 to 5 creatures that are must-kill threats, But like, what are the odds I get them timely? And what are the odds you're going to keep in enough removal to answer them? And is it even going to be the correct removal? Because Go for the Throat may answer a Sheldy, but it's not answering Acklazotz, right? So it's doing this like poker game, saying, what do you think I'm going to have post board? You know, like, do you think you're going to be able to get it, or are you just going to miss board and then we wreck you? You know?
That makes a ton of sense. It's a lesson I've had to learn recently is don't side all of your, single target removal out necessarily game 2 against control, because you don't know what they'll have. It's wild to think about.
Absolutely. And with that, we're going to move on to tier 2 here. Let's talk about Golgari Midrange.
Laplacian took down a 25-player MTGO preliminary this past Wednesday, actually, with Golgari Midrange highlighting a return to Tier 2. This grindy build pushed back against the rise of Control efficiently, beating Ignitus on Azorius Control in the final matchup. So, let's talk through some of these changes. Look, let's just be honest. Domain falling the last couple of weeks has really allowed this archetype to creep back in. That's no secret. And Caustic Bronfidant, this card is coming in hot in a couple of lists, but it works really well here in the Golgari shell. My question is, though, with Bronco being a part of the game plan, do we want Preacher in the 3-drop slot? I wonder if, more 3-power creatures, maybe leaning into Graveyard Hate with Ward Skidder, Graveyard Trespasser would be a more viable strategy. That's personally where I'd go with the deck. But I mean, this one won, so hard to argue against. However, I do love the 3 Duresses main board. Not only is this a good card against Control, but it's good against the go big decks like Temur and Domain. And then that one Goldvein Hydra, I love seeing a main deck embrace this card. Goldvein Hydra scales really well, as you know, in the deck.
So, Max, I look at a deck like Golgari Midrange, and I'm noting that there's no Deep Cavern Bats, there's no Sentinels. This is more of a resource denial, grindy game plan, and it reminds me of that old school Jund with Caustic Bronco playing the role of Dark Confidant, and we still have Lily of the Veil in the format. Is that the correct way to go with Golgari right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to argue against. Caustic Bronco really does kind of speed up the clock and push a little bit more aggression than the deck even does in the mid-range game plan. The other piece of that Bronco is a great offensive card, giving you card advantage, simultaneously speeding up the match on your opponent. I love that. That's really the piece this deck needs. Duress in the main is going to be doing a lot of work in light of the fact that Bronco in the 2-drop slot is a big part of the plan. One thing I would add, maybe cut a couple of cut downs for Virtue of Persistence, because that does hit as a 7-drop with Bronco if that's what you reveal. And, that's helped me a lot in my matches playing the Bronco in mono black. So that's one addition I would probably add to the deck. But yeah, I love this game plan. It's so old school.
Yeah, I love Virtue of Persistence unless we don't get to settle Caustic Bronco and we take 7. So fair.
Yeah.
But with that, we're going to move on to our second list here, Domain.
Well, what can I say? Domain fell off a cliff, right? Only managing a single trophy and only 3 top 8s across 12 events. But featured here is Yoshida Shintaro's version of the deck, keeping the deck in Tier 2 for another week. I love it. This is the one I betted on for a reason, right? Let's take a look at the shifts, though. No temporary lockdowns, shifting over to 3 depopulates in the main. So that's definitely a response to what we're seeing in the meta. The low curve aggro hasn't been as present this past week. 61 cards total, and I'm wondering if that 61st slot actually went to that Nissa to add another win con into the deck. We'll see. 1 Jace in the main seems to be an acknowledgement of Temur Ramp's power in this meta. And then you get both Nissa and Imidane's Recruiter in the main here. Of course, we know Imidane's Recruiter is a supplement to Herd Migration. But still, I think that 61st slot went to Nissa. Double Elish Norn here. Post board, shutting down the mirror, and shutting down, notably, Boros Convoke.
So, despite winning the Pro Tour, Max, this deck looks like it's in desperate need of some help. Where should we be looking to innovate right now?
Man, it's tough, right? Because we think a lot of these flex slots are sealed up. But if Domain were to open up its list and try to experiment a little bit more, the first thing before I get to that, I would say add more Graveyard Hate, right? In the past few weeks, we've talked about how having just the 2 copies of Rest in Peace, the 1 frill back, it's not going to be enough. We saw how resilient Temur Ramp is when against just a couple of copies of Rest in Peace. So you're going to need more. I do like the idea of an ill-timed explosion here, allowing you to hunt for some of the cards that you might need on the top end, and providing a pretty decent board wipe. I also like the idea of experimenting with more Planeswalkers. Some of the earlier versions of Domain had Eternal Wanderer in the 6-drop slot, Kaya in the 7-drop slot, and I wonder if maybe some value from the Planeswalker side of things might help the deck out. If we see a shift towards the lower end of the curve, it might be viable to bring in some Discover mechanic cards like a copy of Quint or Carnosaurs, which act as single target removal. I used to always say in the past that if Domain can find a way to be dominant before turn 7, that really throws off a lot of opponents who are just expecting to counter that big card on turn 7. So I don't know. Gotta try something to make yourself a little bit more unpredictable, and maybe some of those changes will help Domain.
Fair, and I actually kind of like where you went with that ill-timed explosion idea, for the simple reason that like your Sun falls against Temur Analyst, against Azorius Control, it's just like you mulligan if you draw them. You know what I mean? But ill-timed explosion, you don't have to discard the cards. You can just pay 4 mana, draw 2 cards. And I know that's not amazing, but it's flexible. It means you don't have absolute dead slots in game 1, and to me that's fascinating. So we'll see. There's going to be some room for innovation. I think it's going to be interesting to see where people take it. A year ago, we all thought Domain was dead, and then Simon Nielsen innovated and brought it back. I think there's room for that. I really do. But let's go to Boros Convoke.
All right, Boros Convoke. Yamashita Taiki took second place in a 60-player Champions Cup special qualifier in Japan this past week with Boros Convoke, highlighting the best finish of 7 different pilots making top 8s with the archetype. So let's talk about what shifted, because it did have some shifts this week. Let's talk about the big one: Experimental Synthesizer in the main, a 2-of over Yodian Frontliner. The only thing I can think of is, one, it's an artifact, right? But it also provides card advantage. We'll circle back around to that hopefully, but 1 each of Sanguine Evangelist and War Leader's Call. I think this is going to be the balance from now on. I think you're going to see at least 1 Sanguine Evangelist and then 1 to 2 War Leader's Call in most of these decks. We're back to 4 case, seemingly an acknowledgement that we're going more towards mid-range, away from low curve. Having the single target removal really helps against the big wall of creatures that, Shelly's, Glisses, what have you. 2 Pixies are back in the deck. I think Pixie allows the deck to gain some versatility, some endurance, so to speak. And of course, the balanced sideboard, a little bit against everything. Kutzil's Flanker and Invasion of Govicon are something I debate all the time. I tend to side with Kutzil's Flanker, but I see the 3 Invasions of Govicon in here.
So, I mean, the big question is going to be from everybody: is Experimental Synthesizer correct over Yodian Frontliner for this deck? Max, where are you at on it?
So, before I give my final answer, let me talk about what I do like about Synthesizer. It does extend card advantage. Anyone who's played Boros Convoke for a long time knows the frustration of not drawing all the pieces to the combo, so to speak. Whether that's you're missing a Knight Errant, you're missing an artifact to hit with Gleeful, or you're missing that Imidane's Recruiter to finish things off. This helps mitigate against that and helps you find the cards that you need. What I don't like about it is that it leaves 1 less attacker, less damage output overall on the board. Frontliner has this recursive ability. You can blow them up again if you want, and sometimes get 2 Gleeful Demolitions off in 1 game. That's happened more often than not for me. My guess, though, is players are choosing one over the other based on their past experiences with the deck and whether or not you get that nut draw often enough. If you don't, you're probably going with the Synthesizer to make it happen more often. If you do, you're probably going with the Yodian Frontliner. Me testing going forward, I'm going to split the difference 1 and 1 and just see which one comes out on top.
Fair. We call that a nice little compromise, but the deck that does not compromise, Bant Toxic.
Certainly not. Arcany 1 did make it to the top 8 of a 63-player MTGO challenge this past Saturday, making them only 1 of 4 pilots to snag a slot. More importantly, with Control showing out in a dominant fashion this past week, we know this archetype is positioned well to push back. So make sure you check out Deck Tech and Sideboard Guide for free that we just provided on the MTG Rebellion YouTube channel. There's probably going to be a link to it at the end of this video. Go check that out. Sleeveless and Dark did a great job analyzing that list. For now, though, let's look at how they built this particular one. We do have 3 Aspirants Ascent coming back into the deck in the main. Now, I count this with March of Swirling Mist as 7 total evasion cards that you can use to make sure your attackers get through. March is obviously much more versatile, but having these 3 additional cards to help, very interesting choice. And especially with the 1 Slaughter Singer in the main, really pushing the Toxic attribute, and great with Aspirant's Ascent. I think if you can get that off, Very interesting. Now, I want to talk about the mana base here before we go. Botanical Sanctum is not in the deck, and I presume that was the upgrade to Yamibaya's Coast. So I'm unsure here why it's not in the deck, but I think you at least put 2 of in the list to keep the mana smooth.
So looking at this list, especially the sideboard, there are 4 knockout blows in the sideboard. Do we need those, or do we just concede that the mono red match and Boros Convoke matches are bad and focus on beating the rest of the format?
That's interesting that you bring that up, because without even thinking about it too hard, just off the top of my head, honestly, I'd rather have those slots taken up by something like Rest in Peace against the Temur Ramp matchup. I think the red matchup is really bad. I think the Boros Convoke matchup is really bad. I think Knockout Blow doesn't help statistically enough in those matchups. If they go off, they're going to go off, and Knockout Blow isn't going to do too much against it. So I don't know. I'd rather slot against something else rather than have those Knockout Blows in there.
One of those possible scenarios where you look at a matchup and you see that it's like 30-70 against you, and you're like, all right, but post board with 4 knockout blows, it's 40-60, and then it's like, do you still want to be playing those odds, or do you want to be pushing something above 50 to 60% on the other side? So I'm with you on that one. But with that, we get done with our tier 2 list. We are on to Brewer's Corner, my favorite segment every week. Let's kick things off with a little mono black aggro. Alrighty, gang. So I got a little sick of Azorius Control over the weekend and decided I was going to punish it and try to play something that is incredibly disruptive. I am currently sitting on a 9-2 run-in diamond with it. I have lost to Boros Convoke and weirdly a Golgari Roots deck. We're not going to talk about that one. That was a weird loss. This list, though, this is about as fast down to earth as you are going to get. The idea of it's very simple. Everybody else in this format, given all the dual lands, is kind of just planning on starting on turn 2. We aren't. We're starting on turn 1. And we're going to go into that Caustic Bronchodont. We are going to abuse it as heavily as we can. And I want you to just imagine this curve out scenario. You go turn 1 Duress, turn 2 Bronco, turn 3 Gix, Saddle Bronco. You have now probably ripped out their best piece of removal, and you have swung, dealing at least 2 to 5 points of damage and drawing 2 cards. That's on turn 3 before they've even gotten their defenses up and ready, right? This list has that ability. The Carevex may be a little odd to people, but I promise you, play with this card. Just play with this card, grind with this card. You are going to be astounded at the power level of this card with so many pieces of targeted removal and targeted discard.
Yeah, I asked some questions in the Discord about it, but I'm convinced. I think Mono Black is very strong right now, and we'll see how it does this week. But speaking of monocolors, I want to talk about Mono Green Aggro.
Oh, yeah.
Credit to Fukutomi Masuyuki, who got 2nd place in the Champions Cup qualifier in Japan. First card I want to talk about, Sharp-Eyed Rookie. Got to be on this card. These are cards that are enabling Green to even be a deck right now. Sharp-Eyed Rookie extends the game for Green with late game card draw. I love it, and it gets bigger over time. But the real MVP is Outcast or Trailblazer. This is the core of Green if Green's going to be viable. Imagine playing this, whether you plot it or you play it outright, and curving into Invoke the Ancients or Nissa even. I mean, you're getting card draw every turn if you curve out into Nissa. It becomes a serious value engine. And then Bristly Bill plus the Bloomkin, you can imagine a giant turn where you're bringing those lands in with Bloomkin, flipping it, and Bristly Bill is making things giant. The Evolving Adaptive in turn 1 with Bristly Bill and Kadama the Westry is also a great line of play. To curve out into, really get a boost from ramping up and being able to play Invoke the Ancients or Nissa. And then also, just really quick, the sideboard's positioned pretty well. You would think Green wouldn't do so well against the meta, but you've got Pick Your Poison, you got the Baloths, Bouncer's Beatdown, exiling black creatures. There's something here for a little bit of everything in the meta.
Fair. And it's a spicy list. I know we've been looking at, you in particular, Max, have been looking and trying to find a way to make mono green work. I can tell you that Outcast Trailblazer is starting to make waves in Pioneer for mono green Devotion's resurgence despite the card ban. So be on the lookout. It's going to be around. It's a lot better than most people think it is, and it's going to be a problem in Pioneer. That said, let's go to deck number 3 and talk a little bit about Flash Tax. So again, I was on an anti-control kick, a little bit of prejudice, and decided I was going to build something that just wrecked control. This was the solution I came to, which is everything I play can be played on your turn. So good luck trying to stutter step with counter spells because we're going to just play through them. And boy, does this deck do that. You have your 7 early counters to try to keep things in check until you can get your engines rolling. But here's the thing. I played a lot of this deck. I've tried a lot of builds of this deck. I can tell you Stoic Sphinx was the card that was missing. The ability to have a very large beat down, just it does it. It does it. It does exactly what you need. It's the Hottie Djinn with Flash that you wanted for this list because you needed something to close the game out. All your 2/2s that have, hate bear effects are excellent, but if you don't have a closer, you can't slam that door shut. So this deck had a lot of problems with that, and then I put 4 Stoic Sphinx in, and lo and behold, we just started pummeling control decks left and right. They did not have a way to play through it. So if you want to beat all the control lists, I'm not telling you it's going to beat a single aggro list. I don't think it will, but it will beat control.
Yeah, there's something there with the Aven Interrupter and the Stoic Sphinx. There's definitely something powerful there. I agree. But let's talk about another deck, the final one in our Brewer's Corner today, Gruul Terror. Credit to Zelesnia, 3rd place in an MTGO challenge, by the way. What's not to love about this list? At first glance, you know what it's trying to do. You're trying to ramp, right, with the beginning slots, and you're trying to use cards that scale. You're trying to stick the landing with Terror of the Peaks, and possibly Calamity, Galloping Inferno. This card is amazing. Imagine saddling Calamity, by the way, with haste, with a Terror of the Peaks, or a Trumpeting Carnosaur. That's a ton of damage output, a ton of value on the board. I've done it more than once in a couple of Jund lists and a Rakdos list. I haven't done it in Gruul, but I'm willing to try this out. This looks fun. And then let's talk about Smuggler Surprise. This card has modes that they're all great. Fetch more creatures. In the late, you're ramping into the late game. You could play 2 straight creatures from your hand. Make it the Galloping Calamity and Terror of the Peaks or a Carnosaur. Just put those down. That's pretty much game in a lot of situations. You're closing the door very quickly after that. So I can see why this would be very fun to play.
Yeah, it's like that ramp list that doesn't have to play Domain, has some weird pocket combos that you can get into, but like just the value train once you get into the 5 and 6 drops is going to be enough to push you through, even if you don't get into the Calamity Terror combo that it's trying to eschew,
Yeah.
But with that, it'll bring us to our final segment, predictions for the upcoming week. Max, we have looked at 12 archetypes tonight. What are your predictions going into week 5 of Outlaw Standard?
Well, let's review. We've seen several shifts if you just look at what the dominant deck was each week. The format started with Esper Midrange leading the way in week 1. Domain took down week 2, it's safe to say. But then Azorius Control began to rise in week 3, pushing through heavily into week 4.
And if we follow through on this line of logic, we'll see Strong Tempo lists come out swinging in week 5 as they push back against the long line of Azorius, Dimir, and Esper Control players, while retaining some decent margins against Domain and Temur Analyst.
Yeah, and this in turn will spur on Esper Midrange, even Golgari Midrange, as they eat tempo decks up, which in turn pushes Domain back into the limelight as it in turn devours those mid-range lists more often than not.
So in essence, dear listener, the format is fairly balanced right now, which should be no surprise as the ban announcement this Monday didn't see any shifts to standard or most formats, frankly. And we're seeing some innovation still in standard, but for the defined current meta, it's going to be all about getting those reps in and hedging bets till you have a tuned 75 ready for the meta you predict will show up that weekend.
Absolutely. Y'all, thank you for supporting us. And we want to give a special shout out to our members who support our content weekly. Be sure to comment below. Let us know who you think will come out on top this weekend of all these decks. We'll be back next week with more analysis.
Until next time, Rebels. Untap, upkeep, resist.
Resist.